Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, June 15th, 2020. Today, I want to go through a brief history and overview of the life of one of the founders and old revolutionaries. I think we could call him the most important one that most people have never heard of, a guy named John Dickinson. And those of you who are regular viewers or listeners of this show, you know his name pretty well because I cite him pretty regularly, almost all the time. In fact, I've got this membership card. For those of you guys who are members of the 10th Amendment Center, you get these, if you get an annual one. I'm not sure if the camera's going to, well, whatever. It's 110% 10ther because we aren't just 100% on our 10therism here. But there's a phrase on here, Concordia res parve crescunt, which I will touch on in just a few minutes. But we actually put a quote from this guy, John Dickinson, on our membership card because we consider him so important to the founding of the Constitution, the founding of the country, to the revolution, and all of those principles as well. Anyways, I'll get to all that in just a few minutes. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We've got a bunch of different platforms we're on. We're on, I think, 5 different live streaming video platforms: YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Periscope, and Twitch. Periscope is Twitter. We also have archive video versions, library.tv, LBRY. I like that platform a lot. At least one of the founders, but a bunch of people involved are part of the Free State Project up in New Hampshire, and they definitely believe in freedom with library.tv. I'm also on Brighteon, BitChute, and BitTube.tv. We also have the audio-only podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, and elsewhere. You can find all of those different platforms, plus our social media channels, all of the archives to the show. Each individual archive, I put a bunch of links for other episodes to check out, more reading to do, original source documents, all kinds of stuff, so you can do way more than what I'm talking about here for 10 to 40 minutes, whatever the length of the episode may be. You can also find our email newsletter and our membership program where you can support our work for as little as $2 a month. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is the show homepage. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Just take a quick look over at the live chat. I want to say hello to everyone, and I appreciate you joining me, whether it's live or in the archives. I do read through all the comments. I'm not able to reply to everything, but I get a lot of ideas for follow-up shows when I read through comments and questions, or you can email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Over on YouTube, Melody Skaman, good to see you. Timothy Martin says, good morning, love hearing about the lesser-known founders. Me too. Patricia Dance, hi to you. Archangel, Ula Tinsley, good to see you. Aaron Wright, Justin Morrison, Michael Kakowski calls me or somebody a fraud. Well, welcome. People are just jerks on the internet. Dan Warsaw, Citizen Zero, Bob Brewer out in Tyler. Michael also says puke. Well, this is going to be a fun time. Robert Scott Bell, my buddy who does a 6-day-a-week show also on YouTube. You should check him out, Health and Political Freedom, the Robert Scott Bell Show. He's on YouTube, Facebook, and everywhere else. The Salt Lakers, Dennis Marburger, Tyler B., Liberty Freeman, and Liberty Howell. I apologize if I missed anyone. And again, thank you for joining me. I hope you had a really good and safe weekend. Let's get to this. First of all, again, as I mentioned, we've got this membership card. Concordia res parve crescunt. The phrase comes from a guy, John Dickinson. It's a Latin phrase which means small things grow great by concord. But I want to start out with this article by Dave Benner that we published over 6 years ago, back in 2014. Man, we've got over 10,000 articles on our website. And a lot of times I forget that we've published things on something until I've done an episode on something. So it's really amazing the amount of detailed info we have. We just got to get better at organizing it so you guys can find it a little bit better as well. But here's how Dave starts his article. In modern times, few recognize the name John Dickinson. Despite a lifetime of influence and accomplishment, he has truly become a figure overshadowed by other 18th century associates. In fact, very few people even know about him. In fact, most people who know about him have either, well, those of you who are regulars on this show, you guys know the name at least, even if you don't know the full history. I don't know either. There's someone working on a history on him as well, but a lot of people who have heard the name got it from an old Broadway production from the late 60s, a musical. I think it was a film in the 70s. And then, of course, it's coming back to Broadway in 2021, supposedly. And he's made to look kind of like the bad guy. He's on the American side, but he really was kind of pro-British. And he was made to look like the bad guy. And we know how musicals kind of distort, these mainstream things distort history. So that's all we really get about him. Anyways, Dave goes on. Despite this trend, Dickinson was once one of the most famous people of the founding generation and one of the most recognizable figures in Pennsylvania. A further investigation into Dickinson's fight for liberty surely merits additional focus. The penman of the Revolution was his name. He was famous. He had the most popular tracts against British rule up until Thomas Paine. Dave puts it this way, known as the penman of the Revolution, he endured a struggle that would tear at his ideological core and spur his political activism. Despite all adversity in front of him, Dickinson worked meticulously to produce a freer society. He was a Lockean. He believed in natural rights, natural law, property rights, and things like that. And Dave says he did so while recognizing small strides were important ones. And we have a 5-part series that we published a few years ago in recognition of the 250th anniversary of the publication of his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, published in 1767 and 1768. Rob Nadelson did a 5-part series, and just want to give a little brief history of some of the early days. Dickinson was born in Maryland, November 8, 1732, to Samuel and Mary Cadwallader Dickinson? I don't know how to say that. His father was a prosperous planter of tobacco and later of wheat. And by 1750, he decided he wanted to be a lawyer. He went to England. He went to London to learn there. He got his law degree. He was only 18 when he first started this process. And then he came back in 1757 to practice, I believe, in Philadelphia. And he was very successful dealing with private law for quite a while. Now, Rob goes further. He says, in those days, Pennsylvania and Delaware were tied in harness. They actually had a common governor. But before John was 27, he had won a seat in the Delaware Colonial Assembly. And we hear this a lot from some of these leading founders and old revolutionaries. If you watched my show at the end of May about Patrick Henry on his 29th birthday, 11 days after first being elected to the House in Virginia, Henry himself gave one of the most famous speeches of the time, the If This Be Treason speech, and introduced 7 resolutions against the Stamp Act. 29 years old. At 29 these days, when I was 29, man, I was an immature jerk. I was awful. And I think a lot of people at that age really have not, they're still children. They're not acting like adults in many situations, especially in comparison to people like Dickinson and Henry, who were really well-read and studied of history and beyond. So 27 years old, he already won a seat. He was then re-elected the following year, and thereupon his colleagues in the assembly elected him speaker. 28, 29 years old, he's speaker of the House in Delaware. In 1762, he won a special election to fill a vacancy in the Pennsylvania House. He was re-elected in 1763 and 1764, and now he faced a political crisis just a few years after getting involved. Dickinson had been frequently critical of the colony's proprietary charter with the Penn family. Penns were very famous, obviously. However, Joseph Galloway and Benjamin Franklin, these are very powerful figures at the time. They both actually called for the king to convert it to a royal charter. So instead of, because they were concerned about like, well, these local people are being tyrants, we want the far-off government to come in and protect us. They're going to take over and deal with us, get rid of. It sounds pretty familiar to what we hear about today. In fact, most people who actually support liberty, we end up hearing about them at one point or another. Even if they say they support the Constitution, the original Constitution, they can't think of a way to deal with their state or local problems and then end up calling on the federal government. Very similar thing. This is nothing new. Very similar thing happened in the 1760s. And even Benjamin Franklin called for more centralization of power to supposedly protect them in Pennsylvania. So they wanted to convert this to a royal charter to give the king and parliament total control. And Dickinson was skeptical. Why? He said a royal charter, he believed, would leave Pennsylvania unprotected if the British government ever became oppressive. So you always have to think long term. Even if you think that the short-term results might be good because you've got bad guys here locally, and I live in California, so I'm loaded with them, but the last thing I want is the largest government in the history of the world to come in and save me from a local tyrant. We can think of a few here in California, a local tyrant that's primarily being funded and supported by that far-off government in the first place. So Dickinson recognized this problem. Whatever power you give the people today to do something you like is going to be used by someone in the future in ways that you don't like. Now, he lost. They went to a vote on this. He actually opposed this. He overwhelmingly lost this, but he stood his ground. But he was soon vindicated, too. The passage of the Stamp Act the following year, 1765, demonstrated the correctness of his prediction that the British government might prove more oppressive than the Penn family, and the charter change request died quietly. So he opposed it. He warned. He said, like, look, we don't know how they're going to use power if they can just do whatever they want. We shouldn't actually grant that to someone far off. We got to figure out a different way to deal with these local tyrants here in the Penn family. And he actually proved to be absolutely correct on that. Then the most famous thing, where he actually really developed his fame, was a few years later. After the Stamp Act was repealed, they came back with another round, the Townshend Acts, 1767, summer of 1767 or so. And in response, Dickinson wrote a series of 12 letters called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. They were published in late 1767 and throughout the early part of 1768. And here from Wikipedia, I'll include links to all these things in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. The 12 letters were widely read and reprinted throughout the 13 colonies and were important in uniting the colonists against the Townshend Acts. The success of his letters earned Dickinson considerable fame. While acknowledging the power of Parliament in matters concerning the whole British Empire, again, the whole idea, the separation of powers, the dividing line between federal and state, they didn't just come up with that out of nowhere. There was writing and thought and process about this for many decades before the Constitution was even considered, before there was any secession, before there was American Revolution against the British Empire. And Dickinson was basically talking about the same thing, like, okay, the British Empire can deal with these certain issues, commerce, trade, navigation, things like that, but internal issues we have to deal with internally. It's the same type of thing that is set up under the structure of federalism. The 10th Amendment hammers that home. Thomas Jefferson, of course, called it the foundation of the Constitution. Dickinson argued the colonies were sovereign in their internal affairs. And this was in the early days of the transition of thought in the thought of sovereignty. We know sovereignty means final authority, and all through history, kings or queens or a group of oligarchs held final authority, and this was a very important transition in the early days prior to the Revolution, talking about sovereignty being closer to home, and eventually popular sovereignty, the people of the several states held final authority and do so today. So Dickinson argued that the colonies were sovereign in their internal affairs. He thus argued that taxes laid upon the colonies by Parliament for the purpose of raising revenue rather than regulating trade were unconstitutional. Sounds kind of like the Affordable Care Act, Justice Roberts. Oh, it's now a tax. Well, it's not a tax. What is it? It's a penalty. I don't know. No one knows what it really was in the first place, and they just flipped it around just to make it fit within the Constitution. So Dickinson made this same type of argument against that approach in 1767 and 1768. And again, this is the episode that I did. This is in June of last year, so just about a year ago. I specifically talked about the first letter, the end of it, where he signed off with that phrase that we include on our membership card, Concordia res parve crescunt. Dickinson was a total strategist as well. It means small things grow great by concord. He knew that they weren't going to get a popular resistance right off the bat to the Townshend Acts, but he thought that the first thing, especially what was called the New York Restraining Act, they actually shut down the Assembly of New York for refusing to participate in the Quartering Act, and From there, he said, look, the very first thing we need to do is we just need to pass non-binding resolutions showing our support for the people of New York. And because of this, we can actually build on that. Small things grow great by concord. Take one small step, move the ball forward, and continue doing so. I recommend you check out that entire episode when you have a chance. Of course, it will be linked in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, Nadelson goes a little bit further talking about these letters. They weren't just about taxes. And he points out again, Americans had never ceded their right to be taxed only by their consent, given individually or by their representatives. And here's how Dickinson put it. We cannot be happy without being free. Happiness comes from freedom. This is a very early and very powerful statement that resonated with the old revolutionaries, people in the colonies at that time. He says, we cannot be free without being secure in our property. He, like many others in the Lockean sense, recognized that property rights were the foundation of liberty. Self-ownership, in fact, James Madison, I talked about this in a separate episode, James Madison in 1792, I believe, did an entire article on property rights. And he talked about property rights also being ownership of yourself. So if you have ownership of yourself, you have property in your own thoughts, your own actions, and things like that. So property rights are the foundation to many of the founders. We cannot be happy without being free. We cannot be free without being secure in our property. And we cannot be secure in our property, he wrote, if without our consent, others may take it away. That's probably the early version of the phrase taxation is theft. Nadelson goes further. He says, although the farmer letters necessarily focused on taxes, he addressed other political questions as well. One was how a free people should respond to governmental usurpation. Citizens should oppose small usurpations immediately to prevent them from acquiring the force of precedent. And we hear so often today, like, oh, you should focus on this issue or that issue. That's a small one. It doesn't affect me personally. But the problem is, as soon as you turn a blind eye to one issue, then they gain the precedent, the power, and they're going to use that in various ways, and they're going to build on it. They never just keep it small. Government just never takes a new power and then says, well, we're good with that. If you just think about the income tax, which is going to be a temporary wartime measure, a small percentage, a couple of points on the richest of the rich. Look at how it has expanded today. Overall taxation, I don't know the numbers, but it's probably like 40 to 50% of the overall income are swallowed up by government and thrown into bureaucracy and spread around the world for political favors and things like that. It is a pretty nasty situation. But if you turn a blind eye, whether it's that or the Patriot Act or the war on drugs or the war on the right to keep and bear arms, war on property, they all start small and they grow and grow and grow. But the other way around, the converse is true as well. Small things grow great by concord when you do the same thing for liberty. George Washington took the same approach in his famous farewell address. He says, let there be no change to the Constitution by usurpation. Because even if you like, and I'm paraphrasing, 1796, even if you like the short-term results of that small change, allowing government to do something it shouldn't do, turning a blind eye, avoiding it, ignoring it, even if you like the results or you don't want to deal with it, sooner or later that's going to grow. And Washington said that this was written in conjunction with James Madison, who drafted it for him originally in 1792 because he was going to step down after one term. And he asked his friend James Madison to help him out. But he said, this is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Same thing, same message that Dickinson had to say in Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Letter 12 proclaimed, a perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. And we've probably heard some version of this at some point. He writes, slavery is ever preceded by sleep. Turn a blind eye, ignore something, you're always going to end up slaves. But he says opposition should be cautious. You can't just go diving in. You can't just rush in and just, blow it right off the bat because you're going to cause problems. In his third letter, he contended that citizens must first petition. So start out with petitions for a redress of grievances. Then, once that's unsuccessful, then proceed to peaceful civil disobedience. James Madison actually advised the exact same thing in Federalist 46, arguing in favor of ratification of the Constitution. He said, perhaps a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That was one of the 4 tools that he said would effectively undermine and defeat federal programs, whether seen as unconstitutional or constitutional but bad policy. Same thing, a refusal to cooperate. Civil disobedience is an important thing. And I hear a lot of people on the right say, oh, I don't want to engage in that because it's a tool of the left. Well, it's only a tool of the left because you haven't followed the advice of the founders for your whole life. The founders all did this. They all advised it. Madison, Dickinson, Samuel Adams, and the rest. He says that only if both of those steps failed, and of course he's talking about doing it on a wide scale, should they then employ force. And we'll get to him talking about using force in just a few minutes. And this is from a guy, I had not read him before, but there's a publication called Delaware Today that's been around for decades. And this was written by a guy named John Sweeney. And he said it this way: John Dickinson dominated the American cause against British overreach from 1765 to 1775. In fact, he invented most of the arguments against Parliament's taxing policy. He was the guy. He was the leading intellectual. Even though Patrick Henry really sparked the cause a lot in the summer of 1765 through August, over the next decade, Dickinson was really the man, and that's why they called him the penman of the Revolution. His string of newspaper articles, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, Sweeney writes, shaped and articulated the case for American rights throughout the colonies, including John Adams's Massachusetts. And the reason he mentions Adams is because he started his article talking about how a lot of people have a negative, people who've heard of Dickinson have a negative view because Adams complained about him. Now, they don't seem to complain that Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Act. Like, Adams was good at a point, and then he was bad for a while, and then he stayed bad. Then maybe near the end of his life, he flipped the switch again. Dickinson was very consistent. He said the same type of thing over and over, year in and year out. Going further, Dickinson trained and organized the Pennsylvania militia, serving as a colonel when his unit deployed to the front lines. When the British invaded Maryland and marched to capture Philadelphia, he carried a musket as a private in the Delaware militia. This is a humble person who actually was like, I'm joining up. I'm not just going to talk about it. I'm not just going to write. I'm going to actually do something. Going back to Nadelson, let's go up to 1774. He wrote an essay on the constitutional power of Great Britain over the colonies in America. Dickinson illustrated by example what he meant by internal governance. Again, this is really a precursor to how the Articles of Confederation, which he was the lead drafter on, and then the Constitution was set up, and which he supported and helped get ratified. This is, again, delegated and reserved powers. Internal governance included regulation of civil justice, criminal law, manufacturing, religion, the press, and many other activities. His list looks very much like the list the Constitution's advocates offered during ratification debates when they itemized the powers the Constitution reserved exclusively to the states. I did an episode on this last week called The Enumerated Powers of States, where people who were advocating ratification talked about some of the many things that would exclusively be out of the hands of federal control. And almost all of those are in federal control today because people haven't paid attention. So that was in 1774. Also in 74, Dickinson was elected to the first Continental Congress. As he had in the Stamp Act Congress, he served as the principal drafter of public statements. So he was the guy that they went to. At 32 years old, 33 years old, they said, okay, you're going to put together all the public statements from the Stamp Act Congress. I mean, I'm sure it was done by committee, but he was the guy. Just like Jefferson wasn't the only person who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Madison wasn't the only person who wrote the Constitution. These are the people that were known as being kind of the lead writer there. The following year, he was returned to the Second Continental Congress, where he again served as principal drafter. And this is what I found was really interesting as I've researched Dickinson over the years. He was the primary author of, among other papers, 2 petitions to the Crown, of course, the Olive Branch Petition, and the Declaration of Causes and Necessity for Taking Up Arms. This was in 1775. Most people don't even know about this paper, unless you're kind of a history geek and you've looked through this stuff. It really set the stage for the Lee Resolution in July of 1776, then the Declaration, and of course Samuel Adams's famous August 1st speech in support of the Declaration and independence. So the Declaration of Causes and Necessity for Taking Up Arms. And he didn't do this on his own. He and Thomas Jefferson worked together to draft this important document. And the text is a little small. I got it from Library of Congress. My vision is bad as I get a little older, even though I'm wearing glasses. But check out some of these phrases that I think are incredibly important in this. And I encourage you to read the whole thing. Again, link will be in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to make sure you guys remember that link forever. They wrote, Jefferson and Dickinson together, "Our cause is just. Our union is perfect. Our internal resources are great. And if necessary, foreign assistance is undoubtedly attainable. We most solemnly, before God and the world, declare that, exerting the utmost energy of those powers, which are beneficent Creator," I've got that word wrong, I always get it wrong, I apologize, "Creator hath graciously bestowed upon us the arms we have been compelled by our enemies to assume." So they're actually, like, there's fighting going on. There's skirmishes. There's battles already happening at this point. This was in July 6, 1775, when they drafted this. And they're explaining, like, look, this is what's going on. But we're only doing this in defense, and here's why. Our enemies have compelled us to defend ourselves through arms. And some people think that Dickinson was a wimp, was a coward, but he's the guy with Jefferson, even a year before the Declaration of Independence, who explained to Britain, to the people, and to the world why it was important to take up arms in defense of liberty against the empire. "The arms we have been compelled by our enemies to assume we will, in defiance of every hazard, no matter how difficult, no matter how much the odds are against us, we're going to defy that, with unabating firmness and perseverance, employ for the preservation of our liberties, being with our one mind resolved to die free men rather than live slaves." Again, he talked about slavery as ever preceded by sleep. He thought you had to go cautiously, start with petitions, then civil disobedience. Of course, that happened through the Stamp Act. There was similar resistance to the Townsend Acts, but after things like the Boston Massacre and locking down Boston and things like that, it was time to fight back, at least at some degree. And he's making the philosophical case with Jefferson for that resistance. And this one really summed it up nice as well. "In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright." Again, going back to natural rights. You don't have rights because it says so on paper, because the pens or the royal charters or the Constitution. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from him came in 1776. He said, "Liberties do not come from charters. They don't come from documents." He says, "They are just an affirmation of our pre-existing rights." That's, again, a paraphrase. I should have had that one up for today, but they're just a reaffirmation, a declaration of our rights that existed from our birth. They come from our Creator. They come from the laws of nature, natural rights. In defense of our native land, defense of the freedom that is our birthright, they write, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before." Very powerful statement. Again, pretty cool to know that this was co-authored by Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, much more famous, especially through our work and well before us. In his autobiography, Nadelson writes, Jefferson relates a story pertaining to the Declaration of Causes and the second petition to the Crown, the Olive Branch Petition. There was a lot of opposition to doing a petition at that point, but Dickinson really thought that the country was not ready. He was like, man, this is a huge empire. And we hear this from people today. You hear like, oh, get rid of this government agency or do that or end the Fed, end whatever. Anytime you talk about ending something, you're going to have a large portion of people say, well, what are we going to do? This is going to cause chaos. You can't just cut out and run. But a lot of those same people would complain that Dickinson took the same approach back at the time. He just thought there wasn't enough to be able to stand up to them. But he wasn't opposed to taking up arms obviously, because in 1775, he actually laid the philosophical case in support of it. This is what Jefferson wrote. He said, "I prepared a draft of the declaration committed to us. It was too strong for Mr. Dickinson. He still retained the hope of reconciliation with the mother country and was unwilling it should be lessened by offensive statements. He was so honest a man and so able a one that he was greatly indulged even by those who could not feel his scruples." So they respected him so much in that Continental Congress that even though there was widespread opposition to saying, like, let's give it one more shot. All right, we're at a battle here. We're explaining how things are going. This is not good. We're going to continue fighting. We've told them this. And there's no point in doing another petition. We've been doing petitions for ages. He just thought, and maybe he was trying to buy time because he did not think that the militias, the military strength of the country was strong enough. He actually warned that they weren't going to get help from other countries, even though it seemed like he really thought that was going to happen. They weren't going to get help from other countries until they had military victories, which actually proved to be, I think, correct, especially when it came to France coming to aid them. And without the help of another country, it's very likely the rebels or the people fighting for freedom may have had a different outcome. So Jefferson pointed out in his autobiography, like, look, there was a lot of opposition to this, but because he was so respected, we still said, okay, you go ahead and draft this. We'll get it done. He drafted it. A lot of people didn't like it. They thought it was really weak. Like, okay, come on. This is like a backtrack. John Adams, most famously, and I think that's what got into the musical. And of course, this is going to be hammered out in the next Broadway musical in 2021 or 22, whenever it comes out. And Dickinson's going to be looking bad. And of course, Adams again, who was great at the time in almost everything, but he was a hothead. He was always known as a hothead. So anyways, the respect for Dickinson was not universal. John Adams, one of Congress's leading hotheads, that's how he's put here, Nadelson as well, described him as delicate and timid and representatives of people of great fortune and piddling genius. Okay. But by the summer of 1776, Nadelson writes, Dickinson realized independence was inevitable. He knew it was happening. He just didn't think they were ready to fight a war with the empire. He was certain, however, that publicly declaring it was premature. And he gave a speech in July, saying just before they actually did the Lee resolution the day after, and then the declaration on the 4th. He gave a speech in opposition, like, look, we can't do this yet. And he said, and this is, I think, a rare principle. Whether you agree with what his position was on that or not, I don't think it matters. But I think people of principle are very rare these days in politics. And he says, I had rather they should hate me than that I should hurt them. He doesn't care. Doesn't care. I'm going to do what I believe is right. And he characterized advocates of an immediate declaration as wanting to, quote, brave the storm in a skiff made of paper. I mean, he proved to be wrong that it was too early. And maybe that was a stroke of luck or divine providence or however the founders may have described it. I think he was wrong. But it certainly is understandable that he wanted to get it right, because if you lose in that situation, you probably don't have many chances. And all through history, I think we all know that most uprisings get crushed. So he was just being very cautious, moderate middle ground. Going further, Dickinson's speech against independence, like his opposition to the 1764 Galloway-Franklin Charter Plan, illustrates the man's enormous moral courage. There is no record, and Nadelson says, I'm not the first to make this observation, that John Dickinson ever backed down in the face of popular opposition when an issue was important. So he just, whether it's standing up to Benjamin Franklin and saying, you're wrong on this, and then being proven right, or standing up against independence at that time, saying we need to wait a little bit longer, let's push this out, let's delay until we're really ready, and then being proved wrong at that point. He really just believed it and stood on his principles, rather than just flip-flopping based on what was popular. But when it became apparent, Rob writes, that a majority of states in Congress would approve the declaration, Dickinson remained a team player. He and Robert Morris withdrew so the vote could be unanimous. They knew that the vote had to be unanimous. So rather than voting against it, he didn't even vote against it. He just opposed it. And he's like, look, this is going to pass. I don't want to actually create a rift. We're going forward with this. I tried to argue. I tried to convince. I failed in that. Now I'm not going to participate in the vote because I can't in good conscience vote yes, but I'm still on board. And the way we know he was on board is after that passed and after he actually opposed it, he still signed up for the militia. He served 2 stints in the Revolutionary Armed Forces, unlike most of the people in Congress. Most of the people, like today, I mean, I wouldn't call them chicken hawks back then. They're tougher than any one of these people in Congress today. But a lot of them would talk about it, but not actually do something. Dickinson himself actually opposed independence at that point. He supported the principle of using arms to defend liberty. He didn't think it was the right time, but even though he failed in stopping that, he still joined up and served 2 stints in the Revolutionary Armed Forces. Again, strong principles there as well. In early 1788, Dickinson perceived that we're going forward to the Constitution. He was recognizing that ratification of the Constitution was in trouble. We know in Massachusetts it was very close to failing, and it took some work from John Hancock and Samuel Adams making a deal, basically starting the process of setting the stage for the 10th Amendment. That was their #1 request. We want to make sure that there's a clear line between state and federal powers, and we must have an amendment to the Constitution that started the process. So it was ready to fail at that point, and Dickinson was basically on board with that process as well, even though Pennsylvania had ratified very quickly much earlier. But he saw some of the further states, the later states, actually going against. We know New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and others were very much on the border on this. And reaffirming this idea, which became the 10th Amendment, is what actually got the Constitution ratified. And he wrote a series of 9 letters under the pseudonym Fabius. The letters of Fabius were well received and widely reprinted, far more read at the time than the more widely cited Federalist Papers that so many people cite today. The Federalist was primarily written for a New York audience. The letters of Fabius didn't go line by line through the Constitution, but talked about larger philosophical issues. And one of the things that he covered was this doctrine of delegated and reserved powers. And he wrote it this way: America is and will be divided into several sovereign states, each possessing every power proper for governing within its own limits, for its own purposes, and also for acting as a member of the Union. Again, this is about delegated and reserved powers, and that's what actually got it over the top to be ratified. And Dickinson was very influential in getting that message out. He pointed out that any states that allowed the federal government to interfere in their sovereign jurisdiction would be guilty of a breach of trust, for the, quote, trustees or servants of the several states were obliged to protect the authority citizens had placed in them. So it is the duty. We always think of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison talking about nullification or resistance or noncompliance with federal acts, but John Dickinson as well said it was the duty of the people who were elected as representatives in each state to draw a line and stop the federal government from invading those sovereign reserved powers of the people who had put them in trust with each state government. He said, if state officials lose ground to the federal government, it will be their own faults. Just 2 other quick tidbits I want to point out. 1, slavery. This is how Nadelson put it. Another insight into Dickinson's character is offered by his 1781 decision to free his slaves. Most of the founders actually opposed slavery, but Dickinson was one of the few to free his own slaves during his lifetime. I actually believe that Dickinson may be the only one who actually freed his slaves during his lifetime, the only founder, maybe the only signer of, no, I don't know. I think he's the only one. There may be another that I'm not aware of during his own lifetime, but this was a pretty rare thing. He didn't just talk about it, he actually did it. And I think that says a lot about his character. And Thomas Jefferson, when he learned about his death, I think it was 1808. He was 69, 70 years old at that point. When Thomas Jefferson learned of Dickinson's death, he wrote this in consideration of his contributions. This is going back to Dave Benner's great article. A more estimable man or truer patriot could not have left us. Among the first of the advocates for the right of his country when assailed by Great Britain, he continued to the last the orthodox advocate of the true principles of our new government, and his name will be consecrated in history as one of the great worthies of the Revolution. That's from Thomas Jefferson, the man who co-authored the Declaration of Causes with him, who worked with him for many years, who saw him oppose the Declaration of Independence at first, but then go and fight in support of that with his own musket, with his own rifle as well. Well, I hope you guys found this really interesting. I hope you learned something. To me, sometimes doing this kind of a romp through history is really kind of fun. It's a change of pace from talking about a lot of the police state stuff, surveillance, gun control, and all the other things that I tend to cover here as well. So I really hope you enjoyed doing this. I enjoy going through this. If there's other founders you want to hear a history of, maybe we could do a Hamilton one, talking about how this guy was a horrible flip-flopper, and maybe he was well, Hamilton's a bad guy. But if you're interested in somebody else or a different topic, please let me know. This week, I plan on doing, and especially because the Supreme Court, I think just this morning, just rejected any change to what's called qualified immunity. I'm probably going to do an episode on that either Wednesday or Friday. And then I'm also thinking about doing an episode about James Otis covering just some different mental approaches to dealing with government power. He specifically, in 1763, 1764, talked about the most dangerous character to liberty. And I think that might make for a good short episode as well. Let's take a quick look in the live chat. I know I'm running a little bit long today, so I'll probably take a look at it a little bit further. Amanda Macbeth says, very interesting. Thanks for the history lesson on Dickinson. I'll post all of this. In the show notes. There's tons of reading. Like, I just went through some of the highlights, and I think there's a lot more that you can read. Again, Nadelson did a 5-part article. Dave Benner did one article, and that other one from Delaware Today is really interesting. History is getting erased, says Fuzz T48. Thank the Democrats. This is not partisan. Thank all of the bad people in government. This is the largest government in the history of the world. If you only blame one half of the team that's running that government and has been running for a long time, that's just garbage. Restream says, we've received 100 messages today with Restream chat. That's pretty cool. Robert Scott Bell said, dude, you rocked it today. You always rock it as well. RSB, I will see you. I'm going to be hanging out in the live chat during your stream a little bit later today. DR says, thank you, always informative. Would like the Hamilton episode. I think that one's probably worthy. A lot of people that support us don't want to hear about him, but I think actually learning about Hamilton is actually an important part of this whole thing, because Hamilton actually made a lot of good arguments early on, and then we see how he made very novel garbage ones later. And it's a great example of how politicians should not be trusted. Daniel Blanchett says, principled politicians, what a concept. They're very rare. I mean, there's not going to be too many through history that we find. I think Dickinson was. Where he was right, where he was wrong, he was at least standing on a principle that he believed in, and he was willing to do it, even if it made him very unpopular. And he was for opposing the Declaration on July 1st. Of 1776. He actually couldn't get back into political office for like 2-3 years, even though he put his money where his mouth is. Not just his money, like some people were financiers. He actually risked his life and was on the front line fighting for something that he actually opposed. And I think that says it more than anything. And the fact that he freed his slaves in 1781 is pretty great as well. Funky Euphemism says, Mike, if you want a constitutional lawyer to help with information about qualified immunity in law, let me know. That'd be cool. Mike Meharry actually did a great article on this, and I know, Funky, you just interviewed him as well. We added this. If you're on YouTube, we do some playlists, and one of them is interviews. Funky just did an interview with Mike Meharry. It wasn't on qualified immunity, but I just added to that playlist as well. DR says, one of your episodes helped me decide to run for city council in Mesa, Arizona. That's where you can make a difference. Please keep us informed of how that goes for you and things that you may be doing to stand for liberty. Holy Cat says, qualified immunity is a danger to liberty without a doubt. And Meharry did a short video that we posted on our stories this morning talking about how this was a legal doctrine created out of thin air by the Supreme Court. And through centralization of power, the legal fiction of the incorporation doctrine, they take this bad idea and then force it on all the states. And now, instead of one state being horrible and another state of having a chance of being less horrible, or maybe even good on this, the Supreme Court takes one and forces the bad version on everybody. And that's why centralization of power is a problem. That's why people like Patrick Henry, Dickinson, Jefferson, and so many others warned us against consolidation. George Mason as well. Centralization of power is always dangerous to liberty. Anyways, I'm rambling on and on. I appreciate you being here. I will go through the live chat. and the archive comments a little bit later. I will always get ideas for new episodes. If you have suggestions, please post them in the comments or email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. If you support what we're doing, please consider a membership to support us financially. We definitely need your help to continue doing this and growing. We need to grow and reach more people. We make it as cheap as possible, as little as $2 a month. If you can't do it, I don't want you to feel pressure. We're going to continue doing this type of stuff for free, but I want to be able to get the message out to more people, and we can do that with some financial help. As little as $2 a month goes a long way here at the TAC. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And of course, if you can't do that, or you can do both, you can smash the like button. That's free. You can subscribe. You can get notifications, continue leaving comments, leave a review on iTunes. All of that stuff triggers the algorithm of the platform you watch or listen on, and it tells it to show the program to more people. Again, I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start. I really appreciate you being here on this long episode of The Path to Liberty, and I'll see you next time, Wednesday and Friday, here on The Path to Liberty.